All right, let's get you ready for your exam. We're going to break down the absolutely pivotal history of colonization and independence in Africa, hitting all the key points you need to know.
Okay, let's dive right in with this incredible photo. What you're looking at is a dream realized. South Africa's very first democratic election in 1994. It's an amazing endpoint for sure, but it also gets you thinking, what was the long, complicated, and often brutal struggle that led to this very moment? So, to make sense of it all, here's our game plan. First, we'll look at why Europeans came to Africa in the first place. Then we'll get into how they actually ruled. After that, we'll cover the fight for freedom, the massive challenges that came next, and finally, we'll zoom in on two crucial case studies to see the lasting impact. All right, Section 1, the scramble for Africa. Let's really dig into what pulled European powers to the continent and how that kicked off centuries of massive, massive change. You know, it really all started with money. When the first European ships showed up back in the 1400s, the goal wasn't taking over, it was trade. They were looking for riches, for new routes, but what began as a relationship based on commerce slowly, and then really, really fast, morphed into a full-blown quest for total control. Now, we have to stop and talk about an absolutely devastating piece of this story, the Atlantic slave trade. This is so important. For centuries, Europeans traded guns and other goods for enslaved people, fueling a horrific system that ripped millions of Africans from their homes. And this wasn't just a human tragedy on an unimaginable scale. It also systematically destabilized African societies, making them much more vulnerable to European conquest down the line. So how did they go from just trading to taking complete control? What did it actually mean? What did it look like for Africa to be under European colonial rule? To really get a handle on this for your exam, let's use a little analogy. Just imagine a giant corporation moves in and takes over your entire neighborhood. Seriously, they redraw all the property lines, they start digging for resources in your backyard, and they set up their own private security force. And all the while, they're telling you, don't worry, this is for your own good. In a nutshell, that's what colonialism was like. And that brings us to our key term, colonialism. By the late 1800s, this policy was in full effect. European powers, armed with way better military tech, started what they called the scramble for Africa. It was this frantic race to grab territory, to control natural resources, and to dominate trade routes. And this map? Wow. This map shows you exactly what happened. Look at this. By 1914, pretty much the entire continent was carved up and claimed by powers like Britain, France, and Belgium. And these borders, they weren't natural. They were just lines drawn on a map in some conference room in Europe, with zero regard for the people who actually lived there, their cultures, their languages, their rivalries. This map is the direct result of that scramble. But a system like that, as powerful as it seemed, well, it couldn't last forever. Which brings us to our third section, the powerful shift towards independence that would eventually sweep across the entire continent. The demand for freedom came from everywhere. You had a new generation of African nationalist leaders, many of whom had been educated in Europe and saw the hypocrisy firsthand. But they were joined by everyday people too, farmers, workers, and, this is so important, African soldiers who had fought for the colonial powers in World War II. They came home and said, hey, we fought for freedom over there, now we want it here. In places like Nigeria, leaders actually managed to unite dozens of different ethnic groups under one common cause, getting their freedom. And you can see the results right here on this timeline. It's pretty dramatic. A few nations got some form of independence early on, but the real explosion, that happened after World War II. The 1950s and 60s were just this huge, unstoppable wave of decolonization. Nation after nation demanded its freedom and got it. Okay, so winning freedom was one thing, an incredible, monumental thing. But building a stable, successful nation out of the pieces left behind by colonialism, that was a whole different challenge. So what happened next? What was the aftermath? So the crucial thing to understand is that these new nations were basically set up to struggle right from the start. Colonial rulers had almost never let Africans have any say in government, so there was a huge experience gap. The economies were built to ship wealth out to Europe, not to create prosperity at home. And maybe the most toxic legacy of all? Those artificial borders. And this slide, this just says it all, doesn't it? On the left, the colonial map from 1914. On the right, the modern map of Africa. I mean, look how similar they are. These borders, drawn without any local logic, forced rival ethnic groups into the same country and split others apart. It was a perfect recipe for conflict down the road.
To really see the tragic, real-world impact of all these challenges, let's zoom in on two case studies you absolutely need to know: Sudan and Rwanda.
First, let's look at Sudan. After it got independence in 1956, the celebrations didn't last long. The country was almost immediately thrown into a terrible civil war.
The country was basically split in two. The government in the north was mostly Arab and Muslim, while the south was home to different non-Muslim ethnic groups. This division, which was made worse during colonial times, fueled decades of war. At the same time, over in the Darfur region, another conflict exploded between Black African farmers and Arab herders, and it became truly horrific when the government started arming the herders. All this violence eventually led to the South breaking away and forming a new country, South Sudan, in 2011.
Next, let's turn to the small country of Rwanda, a place with two main ethnic groups, the Hutu, who were the majority, and the Tutsi, who were the minority.
Now, during the colonial period, the ruling Belgians had played favorites. They put the minority Tutsi in positions of power, which created a lot of tension and resentment between the two groups. After independence, that resentment just simmered for decades. Then, in 1994, the Hutu president's plane was shot down, and Hutu extremists took control and unleashed an absolute wave of unimaginable violence.
What happened in Darfur and what happened in Rwanda has a specific name. It's a heavy one, but it's a critical term to know. Genocide. It means the intentional killing of a huge number of people from a particular group with the specific goal of wiping that group out. In Rwanda, Hutu militias, riled up by government propaganda on the radio, murdered up to 1 million Tutsis and moderate Hutus. 1 million people in just 100 days. So what's the connection? What's the common thread here? Well, as this chart shows, both of these horrible conflicts were fueled by deep ethnic divisions and a brutal competition for power and resources. And these were divisions that were either created or made so much worse by the policies of the colonial powers. And that really brings us to the final, most critical takeaway for your exam. The legacy of colonialism isn't just something that happened in a history book. It is a living, breathing force that continues to shape politics, economies, and conflicts in Africa today. And it leaves us with this huge question, one to really think about as you study. How can a nation ever build a single, unified identity when its very borders were drawn by outsiders to serve their own interests?